All right, tonight we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 2. And the best way I can describe to you how to find Nehemiah fast is find Psalms and then go backwards a little bit. You'll find Job, and then Nehemiah's before Job. So just working backwards in the way you usually go. And keep in mind, even though we're talking about leadership, as God is working through Nehemiah to do a work that seemingly is impossible, keep in mind we're talking primarily spiritual leadership. Okay, so yes, a lot of these principles will apply to any type of leader, but primarily we're talking about spiritual leadership, and Nehemiah certainly stands out as an example of that. So I'm just going to read verses 1 through 8, just so we can get the context before us. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Okay, so we'll stop right there. So talking about a spiritual leader, unless that person, whether it's a he or she, unless that person's relationship with God is right, then the right relationship with people is not going to be there either. And there's not going to be good spiritual leadership through that process. So, do you think that God will put someone in a position that they're supposed to lead people spiritually, but they don't want to have a relationship with God? Is that going to be God's choice? Probably not. Yeah. There might be some exception somewhere that God has a plan that we just don't know about, and he's going to work through that in some way. But probably in most cases, that's not going to be what God wants. Now, what does God want from us? We talked about this with the concentric circles of concern. What kind of heart does he want from us? Open, humble, seeking him, loving, absolutely. So all these things wrapped up, because if you don't love the people, how are you going to lead them correctly, right? You got to care about it.
If you don't know God, how are you going to talk to somebody about it who knows God? Right.
That's right. Absolutely. So leaders must relate to a heavenly superior, and we would say that superior is God himself. He's the ultimate superior. But leaders also have to relate to human, earthly superiors, right? We're going to look at this context, this passage tonight. It gives us a good example. We all understand what middle management is, right? You have somebody that's kind of a leader or a boss or a manager of something, but there's always somebody above, right? Always somebody who has the final say. So Nehemiah, so to speak, was in a middle management position, which is tough, isn't it? I mean, think about that for a moment, because most leaders in any organization are really in a middle management position, right? Yeah. Usually the man or the woman at the top, even though they have the final say, they're not really involved in all the inner workings of what's going on. So we all would probably agree that middle management is difficult, and there's a reason why it's difficult. For example, if you have someone that's very alert and they're creative and they're just on the ball and they have all these ideas and they want to do something, what's going to happen?
You let them go.
Slow down.
Yeah, the boss is somebody's going to slow them down, or the boss is going to feel threatened.
Correct.
Right? So that could happen too. At least perceived, threat. It may not be an actual threat. What if he's just an echo of his boss, just a carbon copy? Then the boss is probably going to say, "Why do I need you?" Right?
Right.
So on the one hand, he's expecting, creativity and self-motivation and all these things, but on the other hand, don't get too far ahead. Right? So middle management is a very tough place to be.
Can I give you an example?
Absolutely.
We talked about a while ago. I won't name this church, but I know one where the choir director is living with a man they're not married. And the church resents this situation, but nobody will do anything about it, and they've lost some membership because of it. So this person is there. I don't believe by the anointing of God,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't believe God put her there, but she's still there, and a bunch of the church resents it.
Right. But no one will do anything about it.
No, we won't do anything about it.
Well, that's a pretty common story too.
Yeah.
The question is, how can a person in this tough position be supportive and yet at the same time be effective? Right? So it's almost a catch-22. Yes, sir.
You got to be comfortable with your own skills and your own self, knowing that I'm okay in the middle management position you're in.
That's right.
He's trying to help, because if you're not, the other person that you could perceive as a threat is actually just trying to help. You
Yes.
have to kind of take a step back and say, okay, his intention is to be helping. If I support him, it will help the
Right.
team.
And one of the things that will help alleviate either the fears or the worries or whatever is open communication. Right? Have those lines of communication open always, and then you don't have to guess or assume or any of those things that will get you in trouble very fast.
I think even to be a good leader at the middle management position, you've got to know what your boss wants.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And that's where you need to be your starting point. This is what he expects.
That's exactly
us to
right.
do.
That's exactly right.
You gotta listen.
And you have to listen. Yeah.
Some things you have to communicate, you don't want to communicate.
Some things you have to, it's tough. Yeah, it really is. In chapter 2 here, what we read just a minute ago, Nehemiah is in the tenets of the king. So he's in the king's presence. Remember what his position is? Cupbearer. That's it's a very high position in the court, because this king trusts you implicitly with drink and probably food and whatever else people close to him would be trusted with. And there was nothing that he could do without the king's permission. You have to understand, the kings of Persia were absolute despots. They ruled with an iron fist. So he had no rights. He couldn't just do whatever he wanted to do. He couldn't just leave the city without the king's permission. So the kings of Persia, their word was law. And that's just the way they ruled. They were difficult at best, impossible in most situations when people had to deal with them. The one ruler we see in the Bible that was different from the rest of them is King Cyrus. He was the one that when Persia conquered the Babylonians, he came in and just sent a ton of Jews home. He said, go back home. Go back to your homeland. Very polite, very nice in how he ruled. But the ones that came after him, they picked up the iron fist again, right? And just ruled absolutely. And they were often cruel. That's just what history teaches us about these guys. Because of their way of ruling, they were always in danger of assassination. Okay? That meant they always had some enemies that wanted to get rid of them. Or they had people that wanted to revolt against them. So Think about the context. Think about the place where Nehemiah is at. Okay, and who he has to wait on. Artaxerxes was not the nicest person. Okay, so what we see here is actually God's hand at work in the king's heart. So because these kings were usually suspicious of any wrong move at all, anything out of the ordinary, any special request, or any lack of loyalty, at least perceived lack of loyalty, set off alarms in the king's mind. And most people that would do something like that, even make a request like that, the king would, get rid of them, even either prison or worse, death. Nehemiah 2 verses 1 and 2, we see exactly what is taking place here. Of course, Ezra, if you look just prior to Nehemiah, Ezra is actually the one who writes the book of Nehemiah, as he does several of the books of the Old Testament. So Ezra was a priest. He had a long life, and he did a lot of writing. So he's the one that's keeping the records here. Obviously, some first-hand reports from Nehemiah himself. So we get the date here. It says it's the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. And what is Nehemiah doing? He's serving wine. That's his job. He's there before the king, and he even tells us, I had not been sad in his presence. This is remarkable. Do you remember from last week, those of you here, how much time had passed between chapter 1 and chapter 2?
4 months.
Yeah, at least 4 months. 4 or 5 months has gone by. It's remarkable to me that he could go that long without the king noticing something was amiss here. So the king asked him, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. So the king here is very perceptive, isn't he? He sees this. And what is Nehemiah's response? I was very much afraid. Why?
Because of the fact of maybe being perceived as not loyal and
Exactly.
executed.
Yeah. This is Nehemiah's moment. This is what he's been praying about for so long. And now that moment is here. And even though the moment's here and he realizes it, he says, I'm very much afraid, in this situation. Which is fine, but as long as we don't live in that fear through the whole process. Fear is a natural emotion that we experience, but we can't give it power. We can't let it rule us, so to speak. So the king notices Nehemiah sad. He asked him about it. And then Nehemiah was not overcome with gratitude that the king noticed this, or that he was concerned for him. As we have already noticed, he had a right to be afraid because he didn't know what the king was going to do. If you read the book of Esther, very similar situation there, which is Artaxerxes' predecessor, King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as the Bible names him. Esther was not supposed to speak to the king, right? The king had to grant permission first to speak. And Esther went for it. And fortunately, under God's guidance, he's like, go ahead, what do you want, Same thing's happening here. The king is just in this right frame of mind to have this conversation at this moment. But to further complicate things, what did Nehemiah want to do?
Go home.
He wanted to go home. Which, by the way, he never grew up there. This is just the place of his ancestors. Nehemiah was born in captivity in Babylon. So he wants to go to Jerusalem, but what does he want to do?
So much to rebuild.
Yeah.
Build the walls?
Yeah.
How do you think the king's going to accept that news? Okay, so you have to understand that Artaxerxes is the same king which prior, when another group went and they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the walls and the temple, and the Samaritans, which later on, we find out the Jews hate the Samaritans. This is one of the reasons. The Samaritans gave them all sorts of problems. They actually wrote letters to King Artaxerxes saying, you need to stop this. Don't let them rebuild here. And guess what Artaxerxes does? You can't build. I don't want this city to be a threat to me. So that's his policy. That's his law. And now Nehemiah is about to ask the king to reverse that. Of course he's very much afraid. All right? So, Ezra chapter 4, it's just one book back. Let me just read you the letter that was sent. Ezra chapter 4, verses 11 through 16 says, "This is a copy of the letter that they sent. To Artaxerxes the king, your servants, the men of the province of beyond the river, send greeting. And now be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired." They know exactly what to say to this king, right? To get their way. "Now, because we eat the salt of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor, therefore we send and inform the king, in order that search may be made in the book of records of your fathers, and you'll find it in the book of records and learn that this city is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, and that sedition was stirred up in it from of old. That was why the city was laid to waste." And then they say, "We make known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, you will then have no possession in the province beyond the river." So again, they knew exactly what to say to get their way and to stop the Jews from rebuilding. Okay? So that's the position that Nehemiah finds himself in. And of course, Artaxerxes being the king, if you received a letter like that, of course you're going to stop the work. You know, you're not going to allow that to continue, of course. So this was no small matter for Nehemiah to come to the king now and try to convince him, can I go back and rebuild the walls that you stopped before? You know, that kind of thing. So looking ahead, we know that Nehemiah is going to succeed. Right? The king listens to his request. The king grants his request. The walls are rebuilt in record time, where they couldn't get it done in hundreds of years. They got it done. And we know the end of the story. But we want to look at this passage in particular and kind of see, okay, how was Nehemiah specifically, how was he successful in getting this done? So we want to look at some leadership secrets here in how to be successful. The first one that we see is that Nehemiah was loyal. So he showed loyalty. So the first one's loyalty. When the king noticed Nehemiah, what did Nehemiah respond with? May the king live forever, right? Okay, and he was being sincere there. He wasn't just saying words. I think, even though we don't really get this spelled out for us, I think Artaxerxes trusted Nehemiah enough to hear him out, to know what it is that's really bothering him. So he comes to him, he knows he's loyal, he knows he can be trusted. He says, let the king live forever. Okay, that's loyalty there. He's genuine in his loyalty. And he seems to have the king's best interest at heart. You know, he's not setting out to try to overthrow the Persian Empire. He's not trying to hurt Artaxerxes or his family. Who else is sitting there with the king? His wife, the queen, sitting there. So this is like double, you can just imagine how fearful this would be. To be loyal, though, does not mean that we're to appear loyal when we're actually opposed to who we're talking to. Okay, we could probably have all seen that. You know, people say one thing to a person, but then you see them behind their backs, and it's like a totally different story. Nor does it mean that we loyally support wrong actions. Okay. It wasn't like Nehemiah was up there saying, King Artaxerxes, I love how you're punishing these people over here for nothing, or whatever. He's not doing that. It merely means that as long as we are working for someone or anyone, we must be loyal to that person. And if we can't be loyal to that person, then we need to find another job. We need to find another position. All right, so loyalty. The second thing we see from Nehemiah is he used tact. T-A-C-T. Tact. Tact is almost a forgotten art. I have witnessed in the past week so much tactlessness in our community. I mean, from McDonald's to wherever else in between. I mean, it's bad. But notice how tactful Nehemiah was with Artaxerxes. What does he do? He made the king live forever, right? He pleases the king. And then when the king asked why he was sad, Nehemiah asks a follow-up question, a return question, but he does it in a disarming way. He doesn't just respond, maybe the way we probably would have responded. Well, you know what, king? My city, Jerusalem back here, the city of my fathers, this is in ruins, and it's your fault. Now, where would that have gotten him? Not very far. So what does he say? He actually asked a disarming question. He said, I said to the king, why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So instead of making Artaxerxes immediately defensive, what does he do? He wins him over.
Mine has by faith, which is wrong.
Which one? I'm sorry?
But you said by fire. Mine says by faith.
Interesting.
That's on the sheet.
Oh, that's my fault.
Oh.
I tried to read it over to make sure I didn't make a mistake. That's my. It should be fire.
That's a smart computer. I thought it knew what you
It probably changed it. Yeah. Who knows? That's my fault.
It will change it.
So the king understood that Nehemiah had a cause to be sad at that point. This is something that the king himself could identify with because he had his own people, he had his own ancestors, he had his own heritage that he was trying to uphold as well. So he could very well understand this. And then Nehemiah presented his desire as a personal matter. Notice that he didn't make it political. This came straight from his heart, and this is how this is affecting me. And so as a matter of personal grief, the king could understand that too. And notice also the tact here because he does not mention the city by name. He nowhere, anywhere says Jerusalem. Because that probably would have caused some emotion. But what does he call it? The city of my fathers, right? It's in ruins. Dale Carnegie in his leadership book says, if you want to gather honey, don't kick over the beehive. Okay, so that's what Nehemiah was doing there. He's not kicking over the beehive. All right, so he uses tact. The next thing we see is he was honest. He uses honesty. A good leader needs to be honest. All right, so when the king asked Nehemiah why he's sad, he replies with two absolutely accurate statements. The first thing he says is in verse 2, which he actually says to the reader. He says, I was very much afraid. That's an honest statement. He's not trying to be something that he's not. He's not trying to puff himself up here. But the other statement that's also accurate is that he said this to the king in verse 3. He says, my face is sad. The city, the place where my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Now, Artaxerxes knows this. He's heard the reports. It's been that way for a long time, actually. Artaxerxes probably hadn't even thought about it in a long time. But he said, yeah, you're right. That is the way it is. Chapter 1, verse 4, what do we see there? As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept, and I mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Okay, so this had affected Nehemiah from the time he heard the news from his brother for 4 or 5 months, however long that is, to where he's now talking to the king. He is very honest with him. He didn't just try to sugarcoat anything. A couple other things, we need to notice, from the very start, when he starts his conversation, he lets the king know, I want to rebuild. He didn't hold it off to the end. He didn't try to say, I want to just go on vacation and visit the city. I just want to get away for a little bit. No, he showed no ulterior motives. He told him exactly what he was wanting to do right up front. And someone wisely said, if you want to succeed with your boss, don't surprise him. Bosses don't like surprises. They like creativity, they like work, but don't surprise him. He needs to know what's going on. So that's exactly what Nehemiah does for him. All right, so that's honesty. The fourth one is prayer. Okay? Nehemiah was a man of prayer. We saw this in chapter 1. So the first thing he does is he takes it to God. A couple of places we see here. Verse 4 in chapter 2, he says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven." That's a note that he's telling us. He prayed to the God of heaven. So this is after the 4 or 5 months that he's been praying and fasting and really seeking God's plan and his will in this, and how's this all going to work out? Now he's right there talking to the king about this, and what's the first thing he does before he makes his request? He prays again. This is a quick, Hail Mary prayer almost, right? God, here we go. Help me here. So I prayed to the God of heaven. And so now he's ready to speak. But before he speaks, he prays. That's a good, solid lesson for every single one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Before we speak, we better pray. And we see prayer kind of overseeing everything he does here. The fifth thing is planning. Okay? A good leader is going to use planning, careful planning. Nehemiah in the 4 or 5 months was not just sitting around doing nothing. Okay? He was doing his homework. He was carefully preparing how this was going to be done. Okay? Because notice some of the things that we see here. He had a single fixed goal: rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That's what he wanted to do, set up the gates. How is he going to achieve that? Well, that's what he's been spending his time doing when he's not serving the king. Why? You probably heard it before that people who aim at nothing are sure to hit it. Yeah, he wasn't doing that. He had a goal that he was working towards, seeing the outcome of. I found this really cool, funny story about Yogi Berra and Hank Aaron. They were playing against each other in the World Series. Of course, Yogi Berra was on the Yankees and Hank Aaron was with the Milwaukee Braves back when the Braves were in Milwaukee. They were playing in the World Series, and if you know anything about Yogi Berra, he was known for taunting the other players relentlessly. So any batter that came up, he would just be constantly chatting and trying to distract them. So Hank Aaron came up to the plate. Yogi Berra starts talking to him, talking trash and all this stuff, trying to distract him. And he told him, he says, "Henry, you're holding your bat wrong. You're supposed to hold it so you can read the trademark." And Hank Aaron didn't pay any attention to him. The next pitch that came, Hank Aaron knocked it out of the park, over the fence, home run. He jogs around the bases, gets back to Yogi Berra, and he says, "I didn't come here to read." That's all he said to him. That's all he said to him. "I didn't come here to read." He had a goal, and he didn't let anything distract him from that goal. And I thought that was a fitting illustration for us. There's going to be a lot of people out there trying to distract us from what we're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let them do it.
Right.
Just see your goal and keep on going. Don't get distracted. So what we see here is that in the meantime, Nehemiah was gathering what information he needed to know. Yes, he got the initial report from his brother who came back from Judah, but what does he do in the meantime? He finds out who who's in charge of the king's forest, who he names here, Asaph. He knows that if he goes back and he wants to rebuild, he's got to have supplies. So what does he do? He asks the king for a letter to Asaph so that he can get whatever supplies he needs, and even says the things that he wants to build, and even includes a house for him to live in, right? He's thought that much ahead. Because it wouldn't be bad if he got there and he got all this stuff together and there's nowhere for him to live. So he's already thinking about those kinds of things. He also worked out what he would need to get the walls built, okay? Not just the supplies, but he's got to do traveling. He's got to get through some checkpoints because you couldn't just walk through the gates. So what does he ask for? I need letters of safe conduct through these provinces. Can you imagine how impressed those governors would have been? Because here's the thing, Artaxerxes doesn't just send Nehemiah and supplies or letters. He sends army officers and he sends a cavalry. Now think about how impressive that would have been, especially once those governors found out what he was going to do. But he was very specific here. He asked for very specific requests. He knew his goal. He knew what it was going to take to meet that goal. He even had a time estimate. That was the first thing Artaxerxes wanted to know. How long is this going to take? And when are you going to get back? Okay. Why would he ask such a question?
Because Nehemiah was trusted as the cupbearer, and he wanted his cupbearer back.
That's right. Can you imagine all of a sudden having to trust somebody else that you may not have had close contact with? Not only that, but he wants to make sure that, all right, Nehemiah, I'm going to let you go, but don't be leading a rebellion, right? When are you coming back? And so he gets all these things. You see the plans here. And when the opportunity came, Nehemiah was ready. That's what we need to see here. Okay, it may look like 4 or 5 months of nothing happening, but he was getting ready for this moment. But again, what if he didn't think all this thing through? What if he was allowed to go back, but again couldn't get past the governors? We're not letting you through here. Are you crazy? Go back. Or what if he had the supplies and got there, but had no permission to do what he wanted to do? So all these things work together. And so in Luke chapter 14, who has that one again? Luke 14, 28 to 33. This is what Jesus says about wise planning.
For which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first to count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, the man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else will the other is still a great way off? He sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that has been not be my disciple.
Yeah. So we have to count the cost, right? We have to see it through. We have to understand what the goal is. Just like he said, a king does not just go to war on a whim. Now, it may seem like that sometimes, but they're going to see, okay, how much money is it going to take? How many soldiers is it going to take? How long is this going to take, maybe? Yeah, they're going to count that cost and see then, is it worth going forward? He says we have to count the cost in our lives, especially when it comes to discipleship. You know, discipleship takes a toll. If we're going to be obedient to Christ, there's going to be choices that we have to make. There's going to be people that aren't going to be happy about our decisions. So count the cost. The sixth thing that we see is dependence on God. All the way through this, Nehemiah is dependent on God. Now, while he's doing all this planning and getting these figures and knowing what he's going to need and these letters that he's going to go get the king to send, all through that process, Nehemiah is also praying. He does not see any success of himself, of his own. It does not come from just planning. It does not just come from hard work. Those things are good. Those things are necessary. But what he's recognizing is that if there's any favor, if there's any success, it's coming from God. And that's what we see here. Nehemiah acknowledged that in the final analysis of his success was not due to his own careful planning, but it was due to God. What does he say in verse 8? He says, the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. And that's what we need to really see there. God's hand was upon Nehemiah. And at the same time, God's hand was turning the channel, so to speak, in the king's heart. He was directing the king even as he was directing Nehemiah. And this is one of those things, one of those intersections we see in history where it's very clear, right? On paper, on the surface, if it was just us talking about it, if we left God out of it, there's no way Artaxerxes is about to let Nehemiah go. But because God is involved, this is taking place.
He didn't only let him go, he gave him what he needed.
Gave him what he needed. He said, go do it.
Workers, everything.
Right. Gave him soldiers and everything. So the climax of this encounter came in Artaxerxes actually granting the request. You know, it's almost, when we read it, it's a quick statement, right? It's almost like an afterthought. Oh yeah, the king let him do this. But think about all the preparation that went into it. Artaxerxes is granting his cupbearer's request, which was unheard of, almost unheard of. Not only did he grant them, but he seems to have exceeded what Nehemiah had asked for. Again, he sent soldiers, he sent the cavalry, he sent officers that would, you know, protect them on the way. Isn't that what God does with us? So when we ask God, and God grants the request or God gives, doesn't he always outgive what we ask for?
Yes.
Always, always. And we see this principle at work when Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's teaching. He talks about these very things. And we've all heard probably the expression, you cannot outgive God. You can't do it. He's always going to give more. There's two passages I just wanted us to close with. One's Romans 12, 1 through 2. So just read that out loud.
I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect.
All right, so that's a couple of verses that we find in the New Testament, but we find the perfect illustration for a person who did that on an ongoing basis. He did that in the person of Nehemiah. He wasn't there just trying to be the best Persian he could be. He wasn't trying to be conformed to whatever the king's will was. Even though he was loyal, he had a greater loyalty than just Artaxerxes. He was loyal to God. And so what is he doing? He's there every single day, laying it on the line for God. He's a living sacrifice for God. And he is seeking God, he's praying to God, he's fasting, and he wants to know, God, what is your will? What do you want me to do? Perfect example of that, and a perfect example to us for doing that. The other one is Ephesians 3, 20 and 21.
Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
That's right. So again, going along the lines of you can't outgive God. God's going to do exceedingly more abundant than we can even ask or imagine. He said, you come up with the biggest dream you can possibly come up with, God's going to outdo that. And that's God. That's just how God works. And that's exciting that we get to know that God.
And he has no competition,
And he has no competition.
just him.
He's in a class by himself,
That's
that's
right.
for sure.